Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday the 18th of August, and you are watching Regional Wrap, episode 19. Regional Wrap, providing an insight to the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Rivers, Flows and Competing Priorities, are my guests, Chris Brooks and Darcy Hare. Chris was born and bred on the banks of the Murray River in southern New South Wales 60 years ago. He founded and built a grain trading and storage and transport business in his local region to service both the domestic and export markets. Chris went on to become the Australian manager for Glencore Grain for 10 years, exporting large volumes of all grains all over Australia, the Middle East and Asian countries. He retired to a third-generation family farm in New South Wales in 2012 to grow crops under irrigation. This is the urgent chairman of Southern Riverina Irrigators Council, a group of 2,200 irrigation farmers in southern New South Wales, covering an area of 750,000 hectares of country, using mainly New South Wales General Security water from the Murray River storage upstream of Albany, Hume and the Dartmouth Weirs. Darcy is a 29-year-old fourth-generation farmer working with his parents on the mixed cropping farm in Tulakul, New South Wales. Darcy is also the chairman of the Waikol Landholders Association and vice chair of the Southern Riverina Irrigators Council. Welcome, gentlemen. If I could start with you, Chris, could you tell us, the audience, a little bit more about yourself and the changes you've seen?
Bill, as I say, grew up here. My father and his brothers were farmers, growing grain, and having water supplied into this area just made Australia a little bit unique in that it was a consistent producer of grain and grass and subsequently meat and all the fruit and other products that go with it. And with that, over the years that I can remember, from the 80s right through to 2000, every town down here is only sort of 20, 30 miles apart. But every town had an abattoir and had a grain mill or a flour mill or a malt house or an oilseed crushing plant. Labour was plentiful, work was plentiful, income was consistent because there was water there to produce these crops, to keep all of these plants, all this production, all the transport, storage, consistent, which is unique in Australia, as we know, with floods and droughts. And since the formation of the Basin Plan, that water allocation has eroded from sort of, 90-something percent, 92%, I think it was, back to sort of, less than 50. And in drought years, we have zero allocation. And in wet years, we have at best 50% allocation. All of those rice mills, dairy farms, abattoirs are gone. They're closed. We've lost 20,000 jobs. Farmers don't have the consistent, reliable income. People are walking off the properties. It has just been the greatest economic disaster I've ever seen in this region, and it is a crime against the rural people of Australia. Now, that may be a government decision to do so under the premise of fixing the environment. And I just want you to know the farmers here are all conservationists that are all for the bush and the forest that is in the region, and actually voluntarily gave up water to keep a lot of these wetlands alive. And the $13 billion of taxpayers' funds that were allocated to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan to implement this has been an absolute waste of money, because the environment has suffered even greater than the local economy. When you can stop the Darling River from flowing because too much take in the north, which is unregulated, and you've got wetlands like Menindee Lakes, which is the picture behind me, where there are 80,000 birds, it's shut down and dry. And now they're trying to take all of this good water out of the Snowy Mountain scheme upstream of the Murray River, and they have to flood the Murray to get that volume down to South Australia, where most of it runs out to sea. I don't know what benefit that does for the environment, but it is ruining all of the ecology along the river by running at ridiculous levels during fish breeding times. It's wiped out the natural, crays and crustaceans that are in the river, and it's eroding the banks and flooding wetlands that are killing the native trees. If that's any benefit for Australia's environment or economy, then I am an idiot and I've got it completely wrong. But this is a government disaster.
Okay, Darcy, maybe you can just fill us on about your situation, and especially you'd probably have anecdotes and that from your parents and grandparents. You're the fourth generation on the land there. You get a picture of where one generation had it fairly well, and then another generation had difficulty, and has it sort of deteriorated as it's coming up to your generation to take over? So who had the best time?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bill. Basically, my dad always used to say that he had water coming out his ears when he first started irrigating in the area. So he started basically when he was about 15, which would have been about 1980, and he's been farming here with his family and immediate family at the time, and then the family that he's built with my sort of 6 brothers and sisters. Basically, at any point in time, we're all pretty heavily involved. We've sort of inherited this water reform that started back in the 80s when we did have high water tables and salinity issues and management that did need to happen and had happened, but it's sort of morphed into what it is now, where we have to throw water at ecosystems and hope that they get better. There's actually there appears to be no common sense approach where we are looking at protecting the social and economic values that our communities hold dear and their viability. So you've sort of got this, these communities and towns that have been built in the 80s and 90s on that sort of 115%, I think it was, in the 80s and 90s on average of our allocation here, and now we're sort of sitting on about just under 50%. So we've got about a third of the water now in this region. So New South Wales, Murray, general security, compared to what we did in the 80s and 90s, or how my old man started out when he first started farming. So I think they had it a lot easier as far as water access was and pricing. No doubt they work hard and they work long, but now it's about managing a very scarce resource compared to what it used to be, for sure.
Is the water actually scarce, or it's it still rains? Like, contrary to the belief of Mr. Flannery and his 2 Men and a Tinny documentary on the Darling and that, it still does rain. So has the situation changed dramatically because of the less rainfall or that, or simply different allocations or storage or lack of storage or distribution of the water?
I can let Brooksy answer that, or I can answer, but I think most of it's to do with mismanagement. If you look at, I had a good look at the rainfall sort of averages over the last 15 years when compared to 115 years prior. And I agree, we are actually not that different now as far as rainfall goes. It's just that mismanagement that's happening with flooding the Barmah forest, not regulating and publicly monitoring floodplain harvesting in the north, parking over 2,000 gigalitres right next to the Southern Ocean, pumping as much water down there as you can, and hoping that the issues with the Coorong, southern and the northern lagoons are going to go away. And they've always been estuary systems. They've always got groundwater, which is now diverted south. So there's and Brooksy would know this as well. There's about 30 different changes that have happened, within the federal and state reforms to try and manage this triple bottom line, albeit a gross failure. That's resulted in less water for us. So scarcity as far as the water that we're able to use.
I suppose the other thing I'd like to sort of get to in regards to, say, in the situation we suffer up in North Queensland in regards to we have agricultural systems out here, especially with the cane growers and also the graziers. And the general frustration is legislation comes in and this so-called consulting process that goes on, like we had them 2 or 3 years ago, we had the Vegetation Management Act amendments come through, and the consultation, did take place. They had 20 or 30 meetings across the state, from Longreach out to Mount Isa, up to Cairns, Townsville, and everywhere in between. And there was 722 submissions taken, and not one word of the Act changed. Is that the same sort of the deafness of the people who are in charge in, ours is George Street in Brisbane. I think yours is, the real Parliament's in George Street too, isn't it, in Sydney? I'm not sure. Macquarie. Well, that they don't take any notice, and it doesn't matter what information or who well-known expert or competent papers are put in, it still doesn't seem to make any difference to them. So is that the same sort of frustration you're dealing with?
Yeah, exactly. Southern Riverina Irrigators is made up of a group of growers in this region that are adversely affected worse than most of the regions. And I think, Darcy, last count was about 118 submissions that we've made, or reviews or reports that have been, like you say, engaging with communities is the terminology that they like to trot by you, Bill. And as we all know, it's the democratic process in Australia. They come out to all these town hall meetings and they allow everybody to have an input, and they go back and do exactly what they wanted to bloody do anyway. And that's the frustration of it, that regardless of what facts, stats, data, legal opinions, issues that you want to put up, totally disregarded. People are just voiceless in objecting to plans that the government have in place.
Now, I don't know about your Environment Minister down in New South Wales, but after the last election, we got a new one, and I think it's she's the Minister of the Environment, and she's only about 26-year-old. It's her first term, and her chief of staff is a guy called Nick Heath, who used to be the chairman of the Wildlife Conservation Society and that. So he's got pretty good credentials in regards to be an activist in regards to the environment. Do you have any sort of a situation down there where you know pretty well that the bureaucracy around the politicians is that staunched in the sort of green camp?
Well, we have an even worse case scenario. Our local minister, Farah, Susan Lay, is the federal minister, and I think she actually lives up in your state, but she definitely is not interested in any of the environmental issues that we've complained about here. The New South Wales minister is Matt Keane, and I think he is aware, but unfortunately, the Liberal Party have delegated the responsibility of water management to the National Party, and that is our biggest bugbear, that the National Party have controlled water politics and have made a complete debacle of it.
I think there has been a lot of conversation in regards to since it's moved out to be a commodity, if you know what I mean. It's a lot of questions have been asked of some people who have managed to get good money out of it over the past. I don't know if you've come across Shane Dowling, and I think he runs a blog or newsletter called Kangaroo Court. And I mean, I'd never be game to say what he says, because obviously, because he's a lawyer, he's obviously got some skill in regards to defending himself, sort of thing. But he's made some pretty serious accusations about some of the way the water allocations went and the sell-on process and that. So when was water separated from landholders?
After the 2007 Water Act came in. and they basically said, look, you guys are going to have to move yourselves back to the 93, 94 cap. There's been substantial growth from that period of time from 93, 94 to 2007. And to make sure that we do step back behind that sustainable line in the sand, we're going to have to go and buy back water. But at the end of the day, where the buybacks actually happened was not the area where the growth happened over that 14 to 15 year period. I mean, if you look at the four largest valleys in the Southern Basin, you got the Bidgie, Murray, the New South Wales Murray, the Big Murray, and the Goulburn. Every single one of those valleys never actually reached its cap from 93, 94 all the way through to 2007. But because of all of our water was in a dam, it was callable, it was regulated, it was a license, and it could be sold after that separation of land. It was easy to come into our region and buy, and then hold it up in the dam and manage it under the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. And so today, they've got 2,870 gigalitres, and that's just the federal government. The state government of New South Wales has got about another 900 gigs. The View, which is the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, has about 600 gigs. I'm actually not sure, Bill, you might be familiar with how much Queensland has. They have a whole swag of water, and they mismanage it as fast as they get it.
Well, the thing is, they're always looking at, well, it's raised its head again, probably in about 2017 onwards, about the Bradfield scheme and getting water out of North Queensland and send it south, which is a fine idea. But my issue is we in North Queensland don't get anything out of it. There's really nothing in it for us. And the other thing is the people who are sort of pushing the Bradfield and bring more water into the system by getting it into the Darling and let it come down. They really haven't looked any further than what the Bradfield scheme first looked at in the 1930s, when they didn't have the ability that you've got today to look further north, between satellite surveillance and all the rest of drones and better surveying of the potential of water beyond north of where Bradfield scheme is supposed to start, because in far north Queensland, we've got the Mitchell system and the Laura Basin, which dwarfs the Burdekin Basin. But there's never been any sort of hook up in the thing, well, maybe we should do the whole thing and get you more water. Is more water the answer, the long-term answer?
Look, no. In a short term, Bill, I've seen the Bradfield plan. I've been flying a light plane all my life. I've worked in Queensland buying grain, and that river that they're talking about running that water down would be a great idea, but I would be really surprised if any of it ever made it to the Darling. If you can actually channel that water back into that Warrego River to run down through central Queensland, it is magnificent country, and all of that country would be a hell of a lot more productive and would be used by Queenslanders well before it gets to the Darling. And so it should be, closer to the storage and the source. So I don't see it as a fix for us.
So really what you're looking at is fix what you got. Is that what you're saying? That's what the real thing, and you need the people in charge, although they're living in Sydney and completely, they're like the people in Brisbane, completely ignorant of our situation. It's got to be a massive job to do something like that, change their thinking.
It is, and the big thinkers and the big funds aren't available for politicians to put into these projects. They're short-term thinkers. They're in there for short term. But I do think the Bradfield scheme could work, could be beneficial for Queensland. There are other opportunities, at the Clarence there, to turn big volume of water that does run out to sea there back into the northern New South Wales rivers, that would put some more water into those northern valleys. But by the same token, the water that Northern Valleys presently harvest. That is, they stop it from all of those northern rivers. They floodplain harvest it without a license, without a meter, and it's totally unregulated and not paid for. And it's subsequently having the biggest impact on us in the south, who do actually have a license and a storage here with water in it.
Another thing that's likely to come online too is snowy, the brainstorm or light bulb moment of Malcolm Terminal with the snowy 2.0. Have you got any indication whether that's going to impact on you in the long term in regards to pumping that water, keeping that extra water in a holding situation in the snowies rather than its general release? Or you haven't got a sort of grasp on that yet, or indication?
Darcy?
Yeah, so I wouldn't even start the conversation about Snowy 2.0 until they start managing what they've got again. Like, I know we said this before, but managing what they've got again. Like at the moment, there's about 3,000 gigs. I think, sorry, 2,000 gigs in that storage, and they're going to release about 1,000 gigs into the Murray and 1,000 gigs into the Murrumbidgee. When the Murrumbidgee's been in minor flood for about 4 weeks, it looks like it's going to be in minor flood again for another 4. We've had off allocation and supplementary water here in the Murray for a good 3 weeks as well. And they're going to just pump. They've already pumped 400 gigs, I think Brooks is, and they're going to push a further 600 gigs into a system that's been at full capacity for a number of weeks. So whilst I'm all probably a little bit separate to Brooksy about getting more water into the system, 100%, but we've got to look at managing what we've got now effectively. Like in 2018-19, which is what the class action is based on, and we've got 160 days of where we're pushing water downstream for the environment, but also for the productive sector that is demanding water above the supply and above the natural constraints of the system. For 160 days, we're pumping it over the banks to get it downstream. I mean, that sort of stuff has got to stop before we're going to look for, so we've got to have sort of policy and management stuff happen before we start talking about more infrastructure, for sure.
So do they just have some sort of schedule, and this is the schedule they run on, and it doesn't matter what the current situation is, whether you're having a lot of rainfall? Is there just some sort of maniacal overlord system that says, well, this has got to happen regardless of what's happening currently with the rainfall?
That's what we're told, Bill. There are basin rules, and there are supposed to be models that they've designed to set certain flows at certain times of the year, and it doesn't appear to have any flexibility. But it's still a disastrous plan that is just uneconomical and anti-environmental. So again, at what stage is the government going to listen to people actually in the industry or in the environment to say that what they're doing doesn't work, and it is a waste of a very valuable resource in this the driest inhabited country on the planet?
Before we move on, I'd like to just touch on, especially with Darcy, because I was talking to Kevin Patterson earlier on the weekend on another matter, and I don't know if you know him, but and also John Loicato.
Yep.
The number of groups in the basin, you're in charge of a landholders group and association, I think it is, and John's in a water association. And how many different associations, land and water, are there in the sort of, well, just in your region alone, and maybe in the greater Murray-Darling Basin area? And is there a need to sort of consolidate some of that so it's more cohesive and more powerful?
Well, I think Brooksy's probably the best person to answer that one.
We are one group. The Landholder Association that Darcy is chairman of, there are 5 in the Murray Irrigation District. and they each have representatives on the peak body, which is the Southern Riverina Irrigators. That's one group in one valley, and there are 14 valleys in the Southern Basin here, which we formed an association called the Southern Connected Basin Communities that represent all of the Southern Basin irrigators, between 10 and 12,000 irrigators. There are 5 valleys in the north, from the Guida, the Namoy, McIntyre, and border rivers regions that are pretty well banded together again. But because of the problems we have with water being, it's supposedly a federal Murray-Darling Basin Association. It's made up of all the states, and the state of New South Wales is trying to implement one set of rules for the guys in the north and another set of rules for the guys in the south. And that's the biggest problem that we're facing at the moment. There is no cohesion between the north and the south because they're competing for the same volume of water.
So in regards to that, is there sort of animosity between the north and the south, or is there a possibility of some sort of cohesion? The plan, if the whole plan was managed better, or is it just likely to stay at that level of discord?
I wouldn't expect that there's going to be any common ground at the moment. You see, just so you understand that the water flows from the north down the Darling River and into the Murray River, and a certain volume of that is supposed to go towards South Australia. Now, because the guys in the north are not regulated and metered or controlled, they've taken all of the water and the Darling has stopped. So where we've got these great storages on the Murray upstream of us, like Dartmouth and Yuma, 3,000 gig storages each, most of that water now is used. 2.5 million megs is taken just for conveyance down the Murray to run it at a ridiculous high level. And that all of our irrigation water now is used from these storages to go downstream to make up for the shortfall that's not coming down the Darling. So that's what's splitting the north and the south, and trying to sort of get some reasonable outcome within the state of New South Wales first. You can imagine every state has these issues. So the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has this ×5 with all the states and territories involved in the basin plan.
Well, it seems that the northern sector actually needs more water if it's going to use the water like it's going out of fashion. So maybe the government needs to look at things like the Clarence River diversion or something like that to get a bit more over that direction. If there's not going to be some harmony sort of coming out of the north and south irrigators.
Well, true, but we've got an inquiry underway in New South Wales at the moment, an upper house inquiry into this water, and all we're asking them to do is you've inflicted this inflexible plan on us, but it seems to have plenty of flexibility in the north, and you just can't have two rules into one state. So, that is the argument in the upper house at the moment is, what they're doing in the north without any control and without any measuring is unlawful, we would argue. And that's our issue at the moment. And that's why there's a division between north and south.
So just in regards to demarcation or a line, roughly where's the divide between the north and the south?
North of Dubbo.
North of Dubbo, which is a fair way up in New South Wales. That's
it's top half first, the southern half. The basin plan changes at Menindee, as in the water flows at Menindee. Above Menindee is northern basin and below Menindee is southern basin.
If we could just move on to a couple of problem points, and one would be the Barmar choke. That you probably give us a bit of detail. And of course, other end of the system, the South Australian lower lakes and the Coorong and the barrages and the fact that the Murray hasn't really got an estuary anymore. And last week we had Dr. Jennifer Morosi on in regards to her paper that she did in the early, I suppose, 2000s in regards to the problems with the barrages and the need to sort of go back to its natural state, which the South Australians don't want anything to do with. So maybe if you can just tell people what the Barmah choke is and what's the problem there.
I'll do this one, Darcy, and you can do the lower lakes then. The Barmah choke is just a natural restriction in the Murray River, and it takes about 7,000 megs a day, and anything above that, it actually spills over and floods a great big basin there of 80,000 hectares, which is a massive red gum forest. Now, if the basin plan accepted the natural constraints and kept the maximum flows to 7,000 megs, then you wouldn't have the environmental damage that's going on at the choke. High river flows happen in wet years, as you know, and there's nothing you can do about them. And when the high river flow happened, it would spill out over the banks at the choke, and it would fill this great wetland with water about once in 10 years, maybe twice in 10 years. And these massive eucalypt red gums there is all they need. And obviously the undergrowth and the wildlife and the kangaroos, the brumbies, everything that lives there was fine. Now, the farmers here were actually accused of taking too much water and subsequently that the river being run at a minimum to save water in the river was affecting that Barmah forest. So the farmers voluntarily gave up 10% of their allocation so that they had sufficient water to flood that once a year, once every 5 years, I think it was, Darcy. And now the ridiculous management of the basin plan, trying to push that much water down the Murray that they flood that Barmah forest on average close to twice a year. And subsequently, all of that forest is just a wasteland. There is no undergrowth, there is no wildlife, there are no fish, there are no crayfish. And these massive 100-year-old gum trees are just dying because they just can't handle that volume of water. And in the process of flooding this forest to send water downstream, we would argue, and we allege, that they're wasting about 850,000 megalitres of water, which is equivalent to 100% of our region's entire water allocation. So you can see why farmers are up in arms and taking out a class action against the government when we're on a zero allocation 2 years in a row and the Barmah forest is flooded 2 years in a row. That is our allocation they're using to destroy the environment. And that's the basis of the choke and why it's such a sensitive issue, or an example of bad management.
One of the things I don't quite understand is with the environmentalists and the concern by the government about the environment stuff, they don't really have a handle on what outcomes they're causing. Like the instance of the Barmah choke is them being nice to the environment is actually killing it. So that seems to be pretty counterproductive, and the evidence would probably be easily seen to make a normal person, especially one in the area, maybe it's because they're in George Street and too busy down the local coffee shops, talking to the different mates or whatever, and they sort of miss these things because it seems the same situation in Queensland with the Vegetation Management Act. We had a person called Woods who was with the Department of Agriculture and that for decades and was almost leading expert in woodlands. And he had tons of expertise, and he put a big submission in for the Vegetation Management Act plan, and pointed out that it had photos going back 20 to 40 years and the difference in that, and they still couldn't get it through their heads that the way it was and was managed before is much better than what they're doing now. They're just oblivious to it. So it's really is scary that the people who sort of are in charge don't really, or not interested in having a look at the outcomes that they're producing.
We're the same down here, Bill. We all grew up in these forests as kids, horseback, motorbikes, utes, fishing, boats, skiing. It was a wonderland. And it's just a barren wasteland now. And I mean, people need to understand that when this basin around the Barmah forest floods, that water just lays there and goes brackish black, and the trees are under that much stress. They just dump thousands of tons of eucalyptus leaves in there, and the oil in the eucalyptus leaves affects the water. And then, of course, when the floods come back down, they put all that toxic water into the river, and it just takes the oxygen out of the water and kills all the fish. You know, it's not just ruining the native vegetation and the wildlife, it is actually ruining the health of the river as well. And they say this is for environmental flows. I mean, you know, we've lived here all our life. We see the damage, and it's just, it makes you sick. But the economic damage it's causing at the same time, that makes you angry. So you talk to your politicians, you talk to media, you go to courts, and you just really struggle. It's just an uphill battle to try and talk some sense into this government when they're just not interested in participating in any real, you know, connection with people and doing anything for any benefit to fix it. There's just no flexibility in a plan that has no transparency and no accountability for the damage they're doing.
I think it's case in point, you know, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, is that the people there, and because that's where the bulk of the seats are and the politicians, just become so far removed from the rural sector, they sort of, you know, it's an afterthought, you know. Well, that's how we feel in North Queensland anyway. We're an afterthought, and if we're lucky, we'll get some, come election time, we get a bit of money thrown at us. But overall, our general, you know, our general agricultural and primary industry thing is, well, you know, if you want a coal mine, you've got to fight tooth and nail to get it, because you're not getting any help from Brisbane. Our growers don't get any help in regards to, you know, some of the curbing off of some of the regulations. So there doesn't seem to be any interest whatsoever, and we certainly haven't got the political clout now, because we just haven't got the numbers. I think Central and North Queensland in total, we've only got 17 members in the Queensland Parliament, and there's 73 just in that southeast corner. So it's an uphill battle. And I was speaking to David Landini, and your situation's even more dire, because your population is bigger than ours. We're 5.5 million, you're 8.5 million. And he was indicating that you've only got 8 seats, basically west of divide. So your political clout in Sydney is somewhat lacking. So, and then if you've got bureaucrats who were born in Sydney, educated in Sydney, went to university in Sydney, got a job in Sydney, and work in the government in Sydney, and never been over the divide, you haven't got a lot of support in the bureaucracy to look after you either. So it seems to be a universal problem in the rural sector. We can move on to the lower lakes and give us a bit of insight in regards to how the taps turned on and off for them, and how much it affects the irrigators.
Yeah, well, so managing the lower lakes, the Coorong and the Murray Mouth, was a massive basis for why this basin plan and water reform went forward in the first place, because the health of the Coorong, lower lakes and Murray Mouth was deteriorating. We're at critical breaking point, ecological collapse, and all the rest of it. Don't worry about the fact we're in a millennium drought and basically getting no rainfall for a good 10 years. That obviously wasn't a factor. The factor was over-extraction, and the federal government needed to do something about it so that they could retain their, as far as I understand it, retain their senators, or retain senators in South Australia, so that they could get re-elected. And so we've gone through this process where all of the buybacks are targeted to try and fix these issues and prop up an estuarine system to be fresh. That's been estuarines for 7,000 years, until the barrages were installed in the 40s, killing the Mulloway industry, basically setting it on this steep ecological decline over 80 years, where South Australia blames Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland for lack of flows to the SA border. And that's the reason that the Northern and Southern Lagoon are basically a breaking point. And they're not looking at any of the southeastern drains, any of the unconfined aquifers, and reinstating them, because they actually used to flow through from the southeast of SA into the Coorong and then into the lower lakes, and provide that sort of 400 to 450 gigs of fresh water, or groundwater, but fresh water into the lower lakes, and then obviously you would get that tidal influence. But now what they've created there, by not automating the barrages and or removing them, is a total dependence on that freshwater supply from the eastern states, and their thirst is insatiable. Over the last 45 years, they've had about 3 times their so their entitlement's 1,850 gigs, and over that sort of 45-year period, they get about 300% more than that on average every year. Even when we're on 0% allocation, buying in feed in drought for 2 years, they're still getting about their sort of 2,800 gigs across the border, based on these ecological targets, where the government has to adhere to these international agreements, namely sort of Ramsar. So the idea of parking that 2,000 gigs right next to the Southern Ocean is killing the eastern state.
Water, but that goes into the lower lakes, it's only there to hold that artificial freshwater lake. It's not like Adelaide's not depending on that water to drink. I mean, they're not going to run out of water. This is simply just trying to make it clear to the audience that it's simply there to keep this system fresh, fresh water.
Yeah, definitely. So Adelaide draws they got a 200 gigalitre license that sits in Hume and Dartmouth, and they draw their water from Morgan. They've got a pump site there, and that's why you've got that the target for their EC. So the World Health Organization basically says if you're below 800 parts per million drinking water, then it's safe to drink. And because the salinity was creeping up in the 70s, they put aside this loss and dilution component to flush the system, and they also had all these subsurface drainage schemes to make sure they took the salt out of the system before it moved down the watercourse. So no, and obviously they've got the desal plant that was paid for by the federal government that can pull out about 100 gigs a year. But yeah, that 200 gig comes in upstream of far upstream of the lower lakes.
Is there any clandestine movement around to sort of go down and blow up barrages?
I think
how can you reason with people who are just fixated on an artificial thing? Because we've got a similar situation up here. We've got the Cairns Esplanade, and then we've got a boardwalk sort of thing. And historically, it used to be sandy, going back into pre-World War II times. But when the Americans dredged the estuary for the ships and that, they dumped the mud near the foreshore there, and it became a bit of a mud flat. They did offer to reinstate it before they left, but we're so grateful for them saving our butts. We said, no, it's fine, we'll take care of it. Now we've got this mud flat that isn't really, it wasn't there before, and we're starting to get mud flats. Just love attracting mango. What are they? I've had a brain freeze. That's mangroves, and so you get these new shoots coming up all the time, and there's people here who think we shouldn't pull them out. We should just let the mangroves take over in front of the boardwalk. Is that the sort of mentality you have to deal with in regards to this situation, where an artificial environment pops up and people fight tooth and nail to keep it? It doesn't seem like you're conservationists. You're just protecting and environments that are there, not the real conservation side of it anymore.
And Ramsar, if you look at the way that's written, it's about cohabitation of humans within the ecosystem, commingling for the betterment of the triple bottom line together. And if you're going to not look at ways of, say automating, not removing the barrages, but say automating them, like Ken Jury says, with a better way for the Murray-Darling Basin plan. Basically, he says, we can automate them and surcharge it. You can flush out Bird Island, you can flush out the Murray Mouth. You don't have to, similar to what you're talking about, that you've got 2 dredges here that work 24 hours a day and have been for basically the past 15 years, dredging out the Murray Mouth, when it could be done with the tidal prism from the south. So there's things like that that are just totally nonsensical and that are viable solutions, long-term solutions, just totally ignored by government.
So how do you actually get anyone to listen? That's what I'm sort of amazed at. How do you actually make progress, before you pull all your hair out?
I think it has to come to that point where it nearly did in the Millennium Drought. It's a bit like a really bad corner. The council never fixes it until someone has a horrific accident. I don't think we'll ever see a fix in this space until we have a point in time where people are literally fighting for, critical human needs water. And then they'll say, hang on a sec, we need to be looking at what we're using the water for, what reserves we're keeping for the years going forward, and how can we better manage this resource, like not, smashing it through the Barmah Choke and losing it in the forest, not parking it next to the Southern Ocean, not releasing, like in 2017 when we had 50% allocation, they pumped 2,000 gigs out of the barrages. We're sitting there not even close to 100%, and they've just flushed it out to sea for no benefit.
And one of the other things that's sort of interesting about the lower lakes and that is putting the barrages there and changing it to fresh water. Things like introduced carp just made it a haven sort of thing, and whereas the previous natural fish that were in the estuarine environment, mullet way and that, is sort of displaced. I mean, who would ever want a carp? For heaven's sake, all right, fertilizer maybe, but the thing is, who would ever want it in their environment system? They're actual plague of the thing. Yet they've created an environment for this foreign creature.
They have. So if you had this estuarine environment return to the lower lakes, you would expel. So it's the largest breeding ground in the Southern Basin is the lower lakes, because it's always there, it's permanently fresh, and it's kept that way via legislation. They've got to keep it under 1,500 EC 100% of the time, and under 1,000 ECs 95% of the time. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, but just for your viewers' benefits, the seed is about 50,000 ECs. So there's a lot of fresh water, and obviously with the barrages, you've got to keep that salt water out. But if you had these automated barrages, you would remove that environment. And it also goes on to the basin plan. One of their key objectives is on water quality. And as you were talking about them being a noxious pest, they actually increase the turbidity of the water because they do get down in the mud and they do flick it up. And you actually decreases visibility, so your crustaceans and that can't feed. So you're actually decreasing the water quality in the Murray River. Yet, once again, surprise, surprise, at this stage, they do nothing about it.
So where's all the environmentalists in this? I mean, environmentalists run out and club us over the head about this thing and that thing, but when there's actually a real environmental problem, they seem to be completely absent, or are they just that misdirected in regards to the goals? The goals aren't actually the environment.
Yeah, I think it's become about policy science. So what science can we deliver that's going to deliver the policy that we want? It's not about what's the best for the environment or the best for the communities that live in that environment, or the best socially, to be progressive and manage these systems, to the best of the water resources we have available. It's about actually, hey, what gets us those votes in Sydney, Wollongong and Newcastle? More water into these ecosystems is seen as a good thing, no matter actually what damage it's doing to get there or people it's damaging to get there. It's seen as a good thing. So I think, you sort of hit the nail on the head. You've got these, Brisbane is totally separate from your issues and doesn't care or doesn't want to care, doesn't understand. We get exactly the same thing happening here with our sort of power base in Sydney.
I suppose it seems like it appeals to the general population in regards to where most of the votes are, is, the government and the environmental lobby are doing something about more water for the environment. So that's catchy in the cities, and it sort of wins a bit of, pulls a bit of heartstrings and things like that for the voters. So, but they never get told, or they never understand what's been impacted on the ground. And it's a bit like the bushfires we've just experienced. Everyone's, they pat themselves on the back. Well, we're cutting back on foresting, cutting down trees, and we're going to have more trees and that. But I think there was one scientist there who said, some trees are just like have an explosive incinerator in your backyard, sort of thing. He says sometimes it's not a good idea to have too many of the things. So you'd be better off managing your forest and cutting it down and cleaning it, rather than just patting yourself on the back and pushing the idea of you being a great environmentalist by just leaving the trees grow wild, sort of thing. So it's just, it seems that management of the environment has sort of been completely lost, in regards to managing it best for the environment itself and also human use, because water, it's well managed, it's sustainable. Forests are sustainable if they're well managed, but we've got this situation now where it's fashionable or favourable to a bigger audience that if you just let everything run wild, sort of thing, because we up here have wild rivers policy, sort of thing. So that gets a lot of kudos down in Brisbane. So I suppose not cutting trees down in the Alps and things like, get a lot of kudos in Sydney and Melbourne as well, but they don't see the impact that it's having on the environment and on the people in the regions.
Yeah, and to their credit, when you can get the time to sit down, either in a larger forum or one-on-one, and actually sort of take them through what is happening on the ground, they are, they do understand, and they do show empathy as to what you're going through, and you sort of can talk them around. But then obviously people are busy outside sort of, water politics or regional politics, and they sort of get back to their groove and their issues that are close to them and impacting them. And it's sort of, unless you do it in that key time when everyone's doing the same thing and make it an election policy, you don't seem to sort of get the traction that you need to get some meaningful change. To their credit, I think most people, once they've been sort of taken through it by like a genuine person that's, grassroots, sort of soul of the earth person, then they can understand, and they do. But it's just getting them to do something about it afterwards.
But the other thing is having the ability to get the message across on a regular basis to a big enough forum. I mean, the media plays dramas and bad things fairly well, but they don't show good management, sort of thing, from the other half.
No, that's right.
And so that's a problem. It's that disconnect needs to be found, resolved, so that message keeps flowing back more in regular and good messaging back into Sydney, Melbourne, in your area, sort of thing. Another thing I can just touch on, the first time I sort of came across the environment sort of thing at rivers and that in Victoria was with a friend who owned a batching plant, and they used to have a license, and the families had license for years and years that dredged the Goulburn River. Now, for some reason, the powers that be and the people who got in, the university educated people who got into the environment department, obviously came up with the thing that dredging is not a good thing. We should all these licenses out for dredging for gravel and stuff like that, and they basically closed down dredging on the Goulburn, and I presume it went along the Murray as well. But one of the arguments that was first put across, well, if you don't dredge, well, then you got to get built, your river base is got to get full of silt and garbage and whatever. And what happens is your speed slows down in the center of the river flow, and the speed picks up on the bank and starts to erode your banks. And you would think that would be a natural concern, because one of the arguments was, well, if you dredge the river, well, it interferes with the fish growth and breeding and stuff like that. But as this gentleman tried to point out to him, if you don't dredge the river and you speed up on the banks, actually the fish have problem breeding, because that's where they tend to breed, on the slower moving waters and that. So
no, exactly.
Is there any dredging left anymore, or would dredging some parts of the river be any help? Or
I think, well, because obviously, going back before the dams, the rivers did dry out. They did have that chance to sort of recuperate. Whereas now we've got this littoral zone, which is where your structure of your banks come through, is basically getting flooded and it's underwater the whole time. So not only are you getting that sort of silt build-up you're talking about, you're actually killing the root structure and that's been provided by this littoral zone, this vegetation there is being killed as well. So they're undermining it, in those two places. I think dredging possibly does have a place, for sure, especially given that. So if you look at the Barber Choke, she touched on it before, even in the short time from 2008 to 2019, the Barber Choke's lost 22% of its capacity. And the MDBA tried to blame it on a sand slug. But in reality, what you're talking about with the centre of the river, what I'm talking about at the banks, that's what was decreasing their capacity. It's the fact that they were sort of stagnating this river flow and not actually managing anything in between.
One of the things I also, as Chris was talking before, he's dropped out or something at the moment. The number of people involved and dependent on the river systems and water for irrigators, just directly in irrigating, and then the associated industry that serves that is a huge part of the population. You think it probably seeing that such a large number and you've all got such a big common interest, maybe besides the associations, the various associations that you have, and your cooperation between each other, maybe you just should start a new political party and scare Sydney in actually doing it, because you've obviously got a common problem, a common interest, and some common goals, and you're talking about the area, or the whole basin area has got over 2 million people in it, but probably in that southern irrigators and towards the South Australian border, you've probably got 1 million people who are probably pretty well on your side in understanding the need for agriculture to grow and prosper. So maybe the thing to actually get Sydney into action is just say we're getting together and we're going to just form a new party, and maybe they'll come and actually take you seriously or something.
No, well, there's politics got us into this mess, and politics needs to get us out. And I think starting your own parties is one option, as well as infiltrating existing parties, because I think their numbers are actually internally weaker than what you think. So it's it definitely has to be fixed at a state and federal level with political seats.
I'm sort of concerned, I mean, the old country party, and now they're called the Nationals and that. They have, I mean, in northern Queensland, well, in Queensland in general, back in 2007 to 2008, they amalgamated with the Liberal Party. So effectively, Nationals have deserted at least central and north Queensland anyway. So do you feel the same situation is that the National Party, who used and they, as they were previously the Country Party, that used to look after your interests, it sort of lost lost its way in that sort of thing, and some of the voids obviously being filled by, I think you've got an independent and also shooters and fishers or something member as well. So is there a need to sort of give the Nationals a kick in the butt or something to get them refocused on the regions?
Well, we had a Nationals candidate here on a state level, and then we've obviously got Susan May on the Liberal level for the federal side of things. But I think it came back to what David Landini highlighted. We had basically one National Party member here, Austin Evans, and then we had Adrian. I can't remember who was on the Barwon side, but we had Barwon and Murray were both Nationals, similar issues, obviously regionally focused. But when they went as a party to the party room with the 6 or 7 other Nationals from the north of New South Wales, our issues didn't matter because they were so related in that we've got this obligation to supply South Australia with water. That it was a very much a sticking point because we've got dry land farming. Don't get me wrong, but it's not viable on a long-term basis without the irrigation in this area in the Western Riverina. So we need to get a fix where we've got that reliable access to water. And so whenever those issues and or solutions were tabled, they just got knocked back. So I think for us, it's about I think finding a place possibly federally where you can get that sort of Northern Victorian influence, as well as sort of other places within New South Wales, and even Southern Victoria, and try and form it. Because we are, as you said, we are regional, we are sparse, and the population is not great. You need to link up with other regional areas at a federal level, and then try and, in my opinion, sway it that way, because the strength we have at the state level is not there, and then at the federal level, as even now, it's only a 2-seat majority. There's not a lot you got to do to sort of unpack that. So
You also find that surprising that being the driest continent on the earth, our successive governments have failed to sort of get a grip on water in regards to making sure we've got all we want, all we need. It seems like it doesn't seem to be a priority in regards to getting more water. Like there hasn't been a substantial dam built for heaven knows, sort of in the eastern states. It doesn't seem to be. I mean, at election time they talk about different things, but nothing ever eventuates.
Yeah.
Do you think that's sort of surprising, or sort of a real fall down in regards to our governments and successive state and federal? They haven't got some great overall plan to sort of get more water for Australia, because it's going to continue to be a problem as it's always been.
Exactly, and we've got to be feeding 70% more people by 2050. So in 30 years, we're going to have to feed a heap more people, and I don't know of any other sort of global policies that are planning to drop everyone back to 1 child or 2 kids each for the next 30 years either. So we've got, not only do we have a domestic obligation, but we've got this obligation abroad, and obviously opportunities as well come with that to supply people overseas with food. And we're not putting it ahead any sort of roadmap or plan, as you said, to get that online, and the economic stimulus that's generated from that as well now. Like, and all we're focused on is basically giving out cash handouts to individuals and businesses. What we should be doing is investing that, basically printing money in things like infrastructure and dams, so that we can move towards 2050 with more capacity to feed more people, because we are not doing anything about population growth. There's plans and stuff in urban centres, but there's no plans to feed these people.
But the other thing is there is no focus on wealth creating infrastructure. Because it's all about election cycles, there is no this long-term planning, and so it is something that needs to change dramatically. And I mean, the people who have gone before us had much more vision than what we've got today. I mean, I point out that in the 1890s, West Australia had only just become a self-administered colony, and John Forrest was the first premier, And in 1890s, he went out and borrowed £2.5 million, which is equivalent to $40 billion today. And considering he only had less than 50,000 people in West Australia at that time, that's a sort of big gamble. And they built the pipeline to Kalgoorlie, which entailed 2 dams in Mundaring Weir and the Darling Dam, and put 500 kilometres of pipeline and pumping stations to get water to Kalgoorlie. Now, that vision is still there today in regards to Kalgoorlie's still there producing gold. It's still also, you've got Kambalga there with the nickel and that. So that's a marvellous sort of vision for someone back in those days. Yet we're certainly lacking that vision today. There doesn't seem to be anything. So it's a concern.
And you get governments in for multiple terms and they just get comfortable. I mean, even when you do get a little bit of continuity, it doesn't seem to amount to much at all.
Okay, we've just gone over the hour and we've looked like we've lost Chris. So we'll just wind up in regards to what's your hope in, say, next 12 months to 2 years in regards to some sort of fix or some betterment in the situation?
In regards to obviously the Modan and Basin plan.
Yep.
Yes, I think if we could totally remove all buybacks going forward, so no more productive capacity to be stripped from the regions anywhere. Total and full compliance and regulation and licensing of all the water taken across the basin as well. Southern Basin is there, the Northern Basin is not. Making sure that we can guarantee, to the best of their ability, some sort of baseline flow down the Darling River system, to not continually erode the Barmah Choke by letting demand, and they've still got greenfield plantations going in for horticulture downstream of the choke, so there's still demand increasing and supply is still decreasing. So a moratorium on all greenfield developments and the demand that comes with it. And then that a better way for the lower lakes, Coorong and Murray Mouth, to make sure that we're going to change that back to an estuary, automate those barrages, and South Australia can keep their height of their lower lakes, but also not sort of release their dependence on the eastern states, as well as no more reliability reductions in the New South Wales Murray under the guise of these environmental goals they're supposedly kicking. I know that's a long list, but there's been a long list of reductions that we've had over the last 30 years too. So
you can leave it under your Christmas tree, but I don't think you'll get any satisfaction.
No, me neither.
Okay. Thanks very much, Darcy. If you just stay online, I'll just wrap up this episode.
Yep, thanks, Bill.
Thanks very much for your time. It's been greatly appreciated. Next week, we'll be having on Dr. Kevin Donnelly. He's an educator, author, commentator, and blogger. He was instrumental in forming the 2014 national curriculum, which has seen huge changes over the past decade and is a concern now to both him and most parents, I presume, who have got children at school. So he'll be joining us next week. Please join us then. If you like the show, please like, follow, and subscribe. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. So please join me for episode 20 next week with Dr. Kevin Donnelly. Thanks very much.